It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the Farm Foundation for inviting me. I'll try to focus on the bilateral trade agreement efforts here in the United States, but before doing that, I think it's important to really step back and take a look at the changes in the trade landscape here in the U.S. Over the last 2 years. Before 2017, I think in the trade community and certainly the ag community, it was taken for granted that trade liberalization is a positive. The trade agreements were good. The more the better. With more parties, the better. As we've discussed and as others have mentioned, that liberalizing at the WTO provided the greatest benefits, fewer distortions, and broader benefits. The goal of all this was understood to be to create certainty and predictability for traders, including a broad array of rules to accompany market access to provide that security and predictability. And in the case of the U.S. bilateral agreements, it was always understood that comprehensive agreements would be better for the same reason that they would cover all these topics and create a more secure trading environment. Well, that's all changed, and we are now living in an environment where there are certain other assumptions made that trade deficits are significant, that reshoring investment in jobs is a priority, that bilateral agreements are better because we have more leverage in those trade negotiations, and there's also been a very significant reprioritization of the value of security and predictability, and that's manifested itself most obviously in the attempt to obtain leverage in trade negotiations through whatever means possible, including through unilateral tariffs, even when those tariffs lead to retaliation or themselves are questionable under our trade commitments. And in the meantime, as we've already discussed, other parties are moving forward with their bilateral and other trade liberalization efforts and leaving us at risk of falling behind. So we are in a world where the U.S. has stated that it wants to pursue these bilateral efforts, but we've not seen a whole lot of that taking place to date. And in part, there's various reasons. In the case of Japan, they held off for a number of years because they had hoped that we would be returning to the TPP. But for many others, it really amounted to really wanting a little bit more certainty as to what it would mean to negotiate a bilateral agreement with the U.S., given all of these new priorities. So you had a lot of parties who were waiting to see what was going to happen in the NAFTA renegotiation, to see what our objectives would be. Given that our objectives in those negotiations included reducing trade deficits, I think a lot of others were waiting to see, will we actually try to include formal managed trade mechanisms in these agreements. But we have a little bit more certainty now with USMCA having been completed, but we're not finding that we still have that many partners out there. We are now, we managed to convince both the EU and Japan to join into negotiations, though even there it is an important motivator for both of them was the threat of auto tariffs, which they're hoping to hold off on, but they're now at the table. And of course we have China in bilateral negotiations, not for an FTA, but bilateral negotiations also under, as a result of tariffs which were not just threatened but imposed. So let me take a look at some of these different types of bilateral approaches that are being taken and that might be taken. I mentioned earlier that in our traditional FTAs, these were comprehensive. They were not just about market access, but they created an entire ecosystem of rules which created a more secure environment. They included chapters on trade facilitation, on sanitary, on phytosanitary rules, transparency, good regulatory practices, just to name a few. We're seeing the potential for that model shifting. in both the EU and Japan negotiations. There were references in the initial statements kicking off the negotiations to the possibility of staged negotiations with a more limited set of topics included in the first round of negotiations. So for Japan, the U.S. is prioritizing agriculture, but against that, the Japanese are looking at goods more broadly. Either way, however, it remains to be seen how many of these other topics will be included in at least the first round of the negotiation. How much of this ecosystem will be created along with whatever market access is worked out to help create a secure environment. In the case of the China deal, we will find out maybe shortly about what the content of that is. There may be purchase commitments that are made. There will be presumably there will be some solutions to some of the SPS problems that we've had in the past with beef. And maybe we will see some broader rules that, as Ambassador Wolf mentioned, might possibly be moved back into a larger setting like the WTO. But I think it's important to bear in mind that in that kind of bilateral negotiation, the objective is generally to solve problems, specific problems, rather than to come up with these broader rules and rather than to create this broader framework of stability in the trading relationship between the two countries. And certainly when there's an FTA negotiation, the parties are working towards resolving specific problems in addition to creating general rules, but the focus is on creating this general structure. Turning to enforcement and how they're enforced, before dealing with what we may traditionally think of in enforcement and dispute settlement, it's important to recognize the importance of consultations writ broadly, not just dispute settlement consultations, but the committee structures that are set up as part of FTAs that provide a forum for discussing particular issues that may arise and which can review how the agreement is operating. And these really are the first line of enforcement for trade agreements, including FTAs. It appears that the China deal from the press reports will include some similar consultation mechanisms. But here I would just flag one of what was likely to be a big difference on the sustainability of gains from an agreement like that with China. And that is that in the context of a free trade agreement, all the parties have a real commitment or have a real interest in the success of the agreement. And this shows up both in terms of a self-discipline, where both parties are trying to comply with the obligations because they want to set an example for the other party. But it also shows up when there's problems. And both parties in an FTA typically will have at least some incentive to try to resolve those difficulties, again, because they've got the shared commitment to the success of the agreement. And in my own personal experience working with Korea, I saw this in spades, where there really were always actors on the other side who were committed to trying to come up with a solution. And on the other hand, with a bilateral agreement that's simply trying to resolve certain issues, as with China, it's not clear how sustainable those gains will be. I mean, China is at the table right now. They're not necessarily don't want to be at the table. They're there because of tariffs. They're there because they want to resolve or get some short-term security in the trading relationship. They're there for reasons outside of trade. But, and they will come up with a deal as a result of all of this. But down the road, it's very easy to see how those gains can be rolled back if the relationship again goes sour, or if certain commitments were ones which the Chinese only felt that they had been taking under duress. Turning to the more formal types of dispute settlement, FTAs, like the WTO agreement, depend on quasi-judicial dispute settlement proceedings that have independent arbitrators. And I think we heard in the first panel at the end some of the benefits of this approach in terms of containing disputes. The parties to a dispute are supposed to wait until an arbitral decision has been taken before penalizing the other party for any violation. The level of the penalty is often arbitrated as well. And above all, the losing party is supposed to not retaliate once they are penalized. And so these dispute settlement systems play a very, very important function in containing disputes. And John mentioned that WTO is generally preferred. There are technical reasons for that, but still the fundamental approach that's taken towards resolving disputes is one that attempts to contain disputes by setting up a process that both sides have agreed they would follow. In contrast, we certainly have seen how the administration's focus on unilateralism has triggered tit-for-tat retaliation that has escalated. In the case of the steel and aluminum tariffs and the China tariffs, our trading partners retaliated immediately without going to the WTO or FTA dispute settlement. And at the moment, it appears that the administration is hoping to enforce the China deal through unilateral measures. Those measures might be recognized as legitimate by both sides, but it still begs the question of if down the road the U.S. decides that China is in breach of its commitments and decides that it's going to reimpose duties, there will be no neutral arbitrator that will back up will make it easier for China to recognize that they are in fact in violation. They will more likely simply return to retaliating at that point and will be back to square one in terms of retaliation. Just want to briefly mention that there's been some discussion of legal differences, between FTAs, MOUs, and trade agreements. They're all technically legally binding from an international, the perspective of international law. It's not the name that makes the difference, but the enforcement mechanisms that are in there and the incentives that the parties have for compliance. I want to return to the issue of candidates, and one of the reasons why we have so few at this point. One of the advantages of TPP that we lost when we pulled out was the tremendous gravity that this agreement created. By virtue of the fact that it was the scale that it was, and there was such momentum behind the agreement, we didn't have to seek new FTA partners. They were coming to us. They were coming to the TPP parties. You had situations in which Thailand, you had the Philippines, Taiwan, Korea, all of them were looking to join the TPP. In part, that's that predictability that I mentioned earlier. They didn't have to worry about what a bilateral ask might be from the U.S. There were a set of commitments that were completed. They knew the target. And that's an advantage which has been lost. And given the unlikelihood that we'll be returning to TPP, it is a disadvantage we're going to have to contend with. I'll just say a couple more words about the Japan deal. I recently wrote an article in Politico on this topic about the effort of the administration to pursue a very fast result on agriculture. And it does appear that is the type of ask that the administration has made. And it was reported last Friday that President Trump has said, well, we will give up our potential duties on autos if we can get agriculture right away. But that's not going to be so easy. Japan is still holding the line that they need to have, receive and not just give in that first stage of negotiations. They want a comprehensive goods deal. The problem there for the agriculture community here is that if we give as well, we need to go back to Congress. And we've already heard from Ambassador Crowder the amount of time that that can take. While there have been some efforts at creative solutions to get a quicker result in the Japan negotiation, it's very unclear whether those kinds of solutions will succeed. I think I'll stop there, but I'm looking forward to a good discussion.